Jim Morrison was an American singer, songwriter, and poet. Best known as the lead vocalist of the rock band The Doors, Morrison became one of the most iconic and influential figures in rock music history. His distinctive voice, poetic lyrics, and charismatic yet unpredictable stage presence helped propel The Doors to fame in the 1960s. And Morrison's performances were often marked by his wild and unpredictable behavior, which along with his lyrics contributed to his image as a countercultural icon. Now, Morrison's life was also marked by personal struggles, particularly with alcohol and drugs, which eventually contributed to his untimely death. He died on July 3rd, 1971 in Paris, France, at the age of 27, under what many would classify as very mysterious circumstances. Now, this only added to his legendary status and is still something that disturbs rock and rollers everywhere. And I think in order to try to understand Morrison's death, we have to understand his childhood and, as the Chinese call it, his qi, or chi, but his energy of life. Now, Jim Morrison was born to Clara and George Morrison in 1943. Both of his parents were born in 1919, and so both of them were 24 years old when Jim was born. His father was a lieutenant in the United States Navy and held significant commands in the naval forces during the Vietnam War. His family had descended from Scottish settlers who immigrated to America in the late 18th century. His father, George, was somewhat new to the Navy when Jim Morrison was born. George had just graduated 2 years before Jim's birth, and neither Jim nor Clara nor George had any idea how far this Navy career was going to take him. George was actually there in Hawaii and witnessed Pearl Harbor be attacked on December 7th, 1941. In the same year that Jim Morrison was born, 1943, George had started flight training at the Naval Air Station in Florida. He graduated when Jim Morrison was just about 1 year old, and he started to fly combat missions in a Grumman F-6F Hellcat. This is a very serious plane. I mean, his dad meant business. In 1947, the family moved to Albuquerque, New Mexico, where Jim's younger sister, Anne Robin, was born. And it was also in this year that a very traumatizing incident occurred for Jim.
I did. I really looked at him.
The first time I discovered death, me and my mother and father, I'm not sure if a sister was there, whether she was alive or not, and a grandmother and a grandfather were driving through the desert at dawn, and a truckload of Indian workers had either hit another car or just, I don't know what happened. But there were Indians scattered all over the highway, bleeding to death. The car pulls up and stops. And it's my first reaction to death. I must have been about 4. I don't know whether I'm crazy or what. But the reaction I get now, thinking about it, looking back, is that possibly the soul of one of those Indians, or maybe several of them, just ran over and just jumped into my fucking brain.
I could do it.
And they're still in there.
Now, his family came forward and said that this is not what happened at all, like maybe it was just a regular car crash. And his sister said that she believes Jim's young mind might have exaggerated the incident or made up things and sights that weren't happening and didn't happen. And his father also says there was a crash, but it didn't happen when Jim Morrison said it happened, and it didn't happen anything like he said. Like I said, maybe it was just a bumper thumper or just a guy on the side of the road. But I would say this is the first kind of red flag that you see about Jim Morrison's psyche, and as a child sort of embellishing something or creating some sort of tragedy that wasn't there.
One time he just got up out of class and told his teacher he was going to have a brain tumor removed, and he just walked out of class to go read.
Now, the family moved all over the place throughout the 1950s. They lived in New Mexico, and then California, and then Texas for a year, and Virginia in the Washington, D.C. area.
The life that I lived as a naval officer required that you to have a period ashore and a period at sea, which meant that probably half the time I was gone. I tried to make him feel like he was the head of the household, and he tried to take care of his mother while I was gone.
By 1961, the family moved to San Diego, and by this time, Jim was in high school. He attended a school there for a little while, but ultimately graduated from the George Washington High School in Alexandria, Virginia. After graduating high school, Jim went to Florida State University in Tallahassee, Florida, before transferring to UCLA and moving to LA when he was 21. When Jim moved to California, his dad was still in the Virginia area, and by this time, their relationship was really strained. His father obviously didn't approve of Jim's unconventional lifestyle. He wanted Jim to focus on school and his grades and to wake up and make his bed and live a good, clean life. But it was obvious as Jim was in high school that he was rebellious and had a general disdain for authority. Not only were Jim's teachers reporting back to George that he was very disrespectful, but they were also saying he was extremely disruptive in the school, and he was known for engaging in pranks and other loud, disruptive behaviors. It just seemed like Jim really enjoyed pushing boundaries. Now, obviously, his father was the complete opposite. So when Jim left for California in 1964, that was it for him. He no longer wanted to speak or have a relationship with his father, George. In the same year that Jim left and estranged himself from his dad was in a really significant naval incident in the Pacific. This incident is known today as the Gulf of Tonkin, and it was a pivotal moment in the Vietnam War. George's leadership as the naval commander was really what made him a legend and was a key moment in his military career. And Jim Morrison wasn't there to be proud of his dad at all. In fact, not only did Jim lack any sort of awareness or pride for everything his father was doing and for his family, but he actually started going around California telling people his parents were dead when they were very much so alive. And not only alive, but his dad was quite literally an American hero. When Rolling Stone called him out for this in an interview in 1969, Jim said he said they were dead because he just, quote, didn't want to involve them. And then later he said he was just kidding, that it was just a joke he would tell about his parents being dead, a joke he thought was funny because he just never saw them. So why not say they're dead? And then about a year after Jim had moved to California, it was one night in 1965, when Jim decided to go out to a club called London Fog on the Sunset Strip. The Doors, the band he was playing with at the time, had a residency there, so Jim knew the staff pretty well and knew the place well. And at this club, he met a beautiful young woman named Pamela. Pamela was also heavily into the counterculture scene in LA and was known in town for her free spirit and bohemian lifestyle. She was known for rebelling against conventional norms and embracing the counterculture, which is something that matched Jim's own personality and interests. Jim loved Pamela's vibe and loved that she was deeply into art and literature and that rebellious nature. But we see this time and time again. Along with that came periods of intensity and infidelity. There were frequent breakups and then reconciliations, followed by cheating, and then an intense fight, followed by a very intense emotional connection again. And the two of them remained in this toxic cycle with each other for years. But despite everything, they insisted they really loved each other, and they always seemed to make up. Pamela was an art school dropout, by the way, and she was determined to pursue a career in art on her own terms and really make a name for herself. Although that proved a little difficult given her frequent usage of various substances. But Jim was supportive of her and of all of this, of her art and her work ethic, and most of all, supportive of her using whatever she wanted to use, whenever she wanted to use it. In fact, that was one thing the two of them really vibed on, was late nights and just getting really. And if you're wondering where Pam's parents were during all of this, by the way, her father was a principal at a school while she was out doing all of this with Jim in LA. But they continued to date, like I said, from 1965 all the way up until Jim's ultimate death. But in 1969, an event occurred that would change the trajectory of Pam and Jim's relationship forever. Well, a very brief forever, given his untimely death. But it was March 1st, 1969, and the Doors were playing a concert at the Dinner Key Auditorium, which was an old seaplane hangar in Miami, Florida. The venue had been totally overbooked, and there were reportedly over 12,000 people in attendance there that night. Jim was reportedly heavily intoxicated and angry when he took the stage, likely because of a lover's spat with Pam, I could only imagine. But while on stage at this show, Jim became increasingly erratic. Now, he was always known for very unpredictable behaviors on stage, but this night was a little different. He started rambling incoherently and taunting the audience. He was using very vulgar language and urging audience members to take off their clothes, while he, on stage, simulated rated R acts. That's the best way I can put it. And at one point, he wasn't just simulating a rated R act, he actually exposed himself and did one on stage. Now, many people dispute that he did that, but many people do not, and many people say he did do that. Either way, the concert ended in total chaos. And a few days later, Jim Morrison was arrested and charged with several offenses, including but not limited to lewd behavior, indecent exposure, profanity, and drunkenness. He was eventually arrested on April 4th, 1969, but he challenged this and they were set to go to court for all of this in 1970. But in this year of 1969, this very chaotic year, it became very clear to Jim that Pam was the only person in his life. He was estranged from his family. He didn't have a lot of close friends other than his band or people he played with. And Pam was really the closest thing to him, his emergency contact on everything, arguably his common law wife. So, despite all of the cheating and fighting and chaos in their relationship, in 1969, Jim decided to make Pamela the sole beneficiary and heir to his estate, should anything ever happen to him. Now, he signed an actual will declaring this, and not only did he make Pamela the sole heir to his current assets, he also made her heir to all current and future royalties and earnings from his work with the Doors. But honestly, the Doors were not doing well in 1969 when Jim signed this will. After that Miami concert, they had to cancel a ton of shows because of everything that was going on with Jim and his legal battles and personal and physical battles as well. In September of 1970, Jim Morrison was convicted of profanity and all of the other counts from that show, and he was sentenced to 6 months in prison and a $500 fine. Now, Jim Morrison appealed this and was released on bail, and after that, he really retreated from the public eye. And Pam was there to console him and comfort him through all of this. Pam and Jim decided to leave the United States altogether, despite his appeal still pending in the U.S. courts. And in March of 1971, Jim and Pam moved to Paris. This was a very small, quaint apartment on a very quiet street, very tranquil. And Jim's whole plan moving to Paris, and for the first few months and weeks he was there, was to take it easy, kind of have a reprieve from all of the chaos he had faced in the States. He focused on writing poetry and walking around the city, exploring the history, a totally different 180-degree shift from his chaotic life in LA. He also decided, after moving to Paris, he wanted to detox, at least from alcohol. It was reported that he had developed a pretty bad cough as well, likely from all of the use, and that he often had chest pain and fatigue. While in Paris, Jim and Pam became acquainted with a man, supposedly, named Sam Burnett. Sam owned a local Paris club called the Rock and Roll Circus, where Jim and Pam, supposedly, used to frequent. Now, Sam was also a journalist for the New York Times, and he befriended the two of them quite quickly, supposedly, in the spring-summer of 1971. On Friday, July 2nd, 1971, Jim and Pam went to see a movie in the early evening at a local cinema. It was a Western film starring Robert Mitchum called Pursued. Now, the events after this movie vary drastically, depending on who's telling the story. According to their acquaintance, Sam, it was around 2 a.m., or at least the very early hours of Saturday, July 3rd, When Jim arrived at the Rock and Roll Circus Club looking for Pam, wanting to get some heroin from her. According to those close to Jim, he would just sniff heroin. He didn't actually shoot it up because he was very scared of needles. But regardless of how he wanted to ingest this heroin, he still wanted it, and apparently, according to Sam, he showed up at this nightclub looking for Pam, looking for this drug. Pam was there and had some. She gave some to Jim, and according to Sam, Jim took the heroin from Pam and then went into the bathroom. About 30 minutes later, Jim hadn't come out, and a cloakroom attendant who worked at the club went up to Sam and told Sam someone was locked in one of the cubicles in the bathroom and wasn't coming out. Sam recalled he had to have a bouncer physically break down the door, and that is when they found Jim slumped over the toilet. Sam said they were certain he had been snorting heroin because there was foam coming out of his lips and blood coming out of his mouth. And one of the customers of the club, this is all allegedly by the way, but one of the customers of the club apparently was a medic and declared Jim Morrison dead on scene. At that point, Sam says that Pam and Jim's drug dealers arrived at the club, found Jim, looked at Jim, and insisted Jim was still alive and he was only passed out. According to Sam, the drug dealers carried Jim Morrison out of the club, saying that they would take care of him and that everything was going to be okay. He was just passed out. And supposedly after that, someone called Sam and told him and threatened him not to tell anyone what had happened. Pamela didn't call in his death. If this all happened the way Sam said it did, Pamela still didn't call in Jim Morrison's death until hours later. She said she woke up just after 6 a.m. and found Jim Morrison in a bathtub full of water, like he was taking a bath, and that he had just obviously died of natural causes. Now, according to Pamela, she has a totally different recollection of that night, completely different from Sam. According to Pamela, they were never at a club or doing anything like that at all. They just went to see that movie Pursued and then came back to their apartment for a quiet Saturday night in. According to Pam, Jim had a bad cough and wanted to take it easy. They returned to their apartment after the movie and watched some TV before Pam went to sleep. According to Pam, Jim wanted to stay up later than she did, and he did. He stayed up listening to old Doors albums and babying his cough, having some honey and some tea. At some point in the middle of the night, Jim woke Pam up and told her he felt really sick. He then vomited a small amount of blood, again, all allegedly, according to Pam. He vomited a small amount of blood, and Pam insisted they should call a doctor. Jim said no, he didn't need a doctor, but he asked Pam if she could run a bath for him. Pam started a hot bath, and Jim ultimately got in the hot bath, and Pam went back to sleep. Pam then woke up a little bit after 6 a.m. and realized Jim wasn't in bed. She called out his name, but there was no answer. She went to the bathroom and found him submerged in the water. According to Pam, he had a smile on his face, and she thought it was a joke. But then, when he didn't respond, she realized it wasn't a joke, and she called the fire department. But the fire department arrived too late. They wrapped Jim's corpse in plastic and dry ice while Pam made funeral arrangements. She ordered, by the way, the cheapest casket on the market at the time. The casket she ordered would have been the equivalent of about $75 in US dollars today, while Jim's net worth, by the way, in today's dollars, was several million. I mean, the casket was insulting to Jim Morrison. I'll put it that way. A doctor, at some point during all of this, arrives at their Paris apartment and signs a death certificate. Allegedly, apparently, nobody was really there to confirm, but he asked Pam if, and her friend was there too, her friend shows up, asks them if they want to do an autopsy, and they both said no. The death, therefore, was ruled a heart attack. This very, very cheap casket arrived within a day or two and was immediately sealed shut. By the time Jim's manager, Bill, arrived on July 6th in Paris, the casket had already been sealed, and the only people who had seen Jim get into that casket was Pam and her friend and any emergency personnel who would have been on scene. They had a very quiet, small funeral in Paris. Jim was buried in Paris, and it wasn't until after his manager, Bill, arrived back in the United States on July 8th that Bill confirms to the media and to the band members of The Doors that Jim Morrison had died, and he just got back from his funeral. It wasn't until July 9th, therefore, that U.S. newspapers all reported Jim Morrison was dead. And all Bill said when he got back was he just confirmed he had just gotten back from Paris and Jim Morrison had died of natural causes. After this announcement, people started asking questions and raising red flags. The first red flag was that Pam, remarkably, couldn't remember the doctor's name who signed the death certificate, and the signature on the death certificate was completely illegible. People also questioned how Jim's own parents didn't even know about his death. Typically, in a situation like that, the American embassy notifies immediate family members right away, which meant that either the French authorities never arrived at Pam and Jim's apartment in the first place and never notified the U.S. embassy, or it means Pam had to have lied to the authorities and lied to the U.S. embassy, saying that Jim Morrison had no immediate family members alive needing to be notified. That's the only way he could have had such a fast, no questions asked burial in France. The keyboardist for The Doors at the time questioned Bill when he returned from the funeral, famously asking him, "How do you even know Jim was in the coffin? How do you know it wasn't 150 pounds of sand?" Because Bill never saw him. No one ever saw him in the coffin. Many of Jim's friends also came forward and said Jim actually didn't do hard drugs at all. Pam and Sam and other people in Paris were saying that he was snorting heroin. But his friends in the States said, no, he wasn't. He hated needles and hated hard drugs. They also believed he was detoxing from everything in Paris, not just alcohol. They also said something that really raised the hair on the back of people's necks. They reportedly said many times before, Jim had talked about the notion of faking his own death as a publicity stunt, supposedly, specifically, saying he would disappear to Africa and change his name to Mr. Moho Rising, an anagram for Jim Morrison. After Jim Morrison's death, there were reported sightings of Jim in Tibet, in Australia, and Africa. But regardless if Jim was still alive or not, Pamela, per Jim's will that he signed in 1969, received 100% of his estate, royalties, and future earnings, although it was a little bit short-lived. Immediately following his very cheap and quiet and mysterious Paris burial, Pam returned to LA with either a lot of grief or a lot of guilt. It's hard to tell, but she was very emotionally unwell returning to LA. And not only was she faced with grief and guilt, she was also faced with a lawsuit from Jim Morrison's parents. His parents were arguing to the courts that because Pam and Jim were never legally married, Pam should not be entitled to 100% of his estate. Throughout these court proceedings over the next year to 2 years, Pamela fell deeper and deeper into a heroin spiral, making it very obvious she struggled with heroin use, and people began speculating the role she played in Jim's death even more so. Pam ultimately died a few years later in 1974, reportedly from a heroin herself, also at the age of 27. The same age that Jim Morrison was when he died. After her death, the legal battle for Jim's estate continued. However, now it wasn't just between Jim Morrison's family and Pam. Now it was between Jim's family and Pam's family. Ultimately, the courts decided to split the estate 50-50 between the Morrisons and Pam's family. And I don't think Pam ever really expected there to be that big of a legal battle here, to be honest. I think she 100% thought that since Jim signed that will, It didn't matter if they were married or not. There would be no question she would get everything. And even if Jim did die of a heroin overdose in Paris, it still begs the question, was Pam an enormously negative influence on him? Was she responsible in some way for his downward spirals, each and every one of them? Jim was reportedly trying to detox in Paris and live a quieter life. Was Pam the one pushing heroin and other drugs into their lives? Was she the one supplying it to him and fueling his addiction? Was she the one who gave him that final lethal dose? And if so, did she do it by accident or on purpose? Was Jim Morrison actually having a quiet night in on that Saturday night? Was he genuinely suffering from a cough? And did Pam give him something supposedly as cough medicine instead? Or was she an accomplice to an enormously elaborate scheme for Jim to do what he always talked about and disappear to another country, away from all the bullshit he found himself in the United States? Jim Morrison would be 81 years old today, and the world may never know the truth. But I'm curious what you think about Jim Morrison's death. Do you think that Pamela played a role in all of this? And if so, how do you think it all went down? Do you think the French authorities ever showed up at their apartment in the first place? Did she lie to them and tell them he had no immediate family? Did she lie to the US Embassy? Was the whole funeral fake? If you like this type of content, please don't forget to hit the thumbs up button and subscribe to the channel. You can also give me a super thanks. A super thanks is a button at the bottom of the play bar that allows you to donate any amount of money that you would like to the channel, or you can help directly with the research by buying me a coffee. A link to the Buy Me a Coffee is in the description down below. And I will see you all on the next Roots Rockumentary.
Hungry for the road all my life, thirsty for adventure all my youth, chasing all my freedoms down Liberty Avenue.